Thanks for joining us today. I know a bunch of you guys are in Paris at ETH Paris, including me. So it's not, forgotten that this is 10 p.m. And so we really appreciate your being here right now. But I promise it'll be really worth it. Today, we have Casey Winters here with us, who is leading a session about growth loops, onboarding, and product market fit. I'll give a brief run of the show for today before we dive in. So first, we'll hand it over to Casey to do a presentation that is really distilled from his years of experience leading product and leading growth. Then we'll take audience questions with Casey. And so if you have questions that throughout the presentation, just drop them into the chat and we'll address them at the end. And then before we wrap up, we'll break out into small group discussions afterwards to synthesize takeaways and learnings for about the last 30 minutes. So that's the agenda for today. And before we get started, I wanted to share a quick introduction for Casey. So Casey Winters, who is here with us, is one of the foremost experts in the world about growth. He, I think, unpacks growth topics in a way that is really incisive and actionable and really turns growth into a science that can be optimized and implemented in a really tactical way. He's helped many Web2 brands and businesses cross key milestones and reach the next levels of their businesses. Previously in his career, Casey started the marketing team at Grubhub. He led the growth product team at Pinterest. And then most recently, he worked as the chief product officer at Eventbrite during the very tumultuous pandemic years when events were obviously going remote. And in each of those roles, Casey led major expansion efforts that resulted in user growth, for instance, driving Grubhub from 3 cities to over 1,000 cities, optimize user behavior at each of those companies, including increasing sign-up conversion at Pinterest 5-fold. And he also led various product pivots, including refocusing Eventbrite's strategy to outlast the pandemic difficulties. And so throughout all of these experiences, he's gleaned a ton of insights about growth, retention, and onboarding that I think really transcend the Web2 world and are applicable for early stage founders, no matter what your vertical is. And today, Casey works as a strategic advisor for tech startups and has worked with companies like Airbnb, Canva, Fray, Whatnot, Reddit, Tinder, as well as Greylock, the venture firm. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Casey for his presentation that he'll take us through.
Thanks, Lee, for the great introduction. I will try to share my screen and then slideshow this. Everyone can see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Well, I don't need to cover this slide because Lee did a really good job. So I'll just skip straight to the content. But today we're going to talk about 3 topics, basically: product market fit, developing growth loops, and then onboarding. And you'll see why those 3 are connected as I go through the presentation, hopefully. So first, you probably all obsess over the concept of product market fit. And, generally when I talk with founders, there's a lot of confusion on what it means to have product market fit. And, if you go like Google advice on the internet, generally the best you get is something like this, which is like, oh, people will use your product, you love it, they'd be pissed if it went away. Your main problem is that how do I get more customers, not do I have a product that works? And if you're like me and you're very quantitative, you find this like absolutely unhelpful. And if you've gone deeper into the topic, which I know you all have because of who you've accepted money from, you've read this post from Rahul, the founder of Superhuman, and it basically adapts this concept called the Sean Ellis test into a more rigorous framework to see if you're on the path to product market fit. This post is great. It's instructive. It's also not what I want to talk about today because it's still a survey-based, meaning more qualitative view on what it means to find product market fit. And as Lee said, I'm a little bit more of a science person. So I want practical data to say whether we have product market fit or not. So I'm going to walk you through what it takes to build that data. So the first is figuring out what metrics actually matter. And retention is usually where we start for 9 out of 10 businesses. Sure, there are some businesses that are not retention oriented, which we could talk about those edge cases if you have a question there, in the Q&A. But for most businesses, we're trying to get people to use a product regularly. And to do that, we need to understand what is something they do in the product that we can measure that indicates they're receiving the value we intend them to receive. We call that the key action in Reforge parlance. And secondly, we're trying to figure out how often we should expect the user to want to receive that value, which we call the designated frequency. So, for Grubhub, going through this exercise, super easy. There's only one thing you can do. It's order food and have it show up and be, tasty. And people did this activity before the internet existed. They ordered food. They just used the phone to call the restaurant. They waited on hold, all that kind of stuff. So you can look at how often they did that to try to determine what your designated frequency should be. And we found that most people order food once or twice a month back then. So we set our designated frequency target as monthly. Super simple, no controversy. But in trying to replicate this exercise for Pinterest, it's a lot harder. Not a transactional business. So there's actually lots of things you can do inside the Pinterest product. You can save content we show you for later. You can click through to the content to learn more about it and potentially buy it, whatever. Or you could just browse lots of content. So we actually had to do more analysis to say which of these best correlates to us seeing that real product value has been delivered. Click through had clickbait issues. Browsing could show a lot of intent, but us actually not surfacing the right content for you. So saving was definitely the best in terms of we recommended something, you liked it enough that you wanted to get back to it later. Offline analog was also fairly easy for Pinterest. What did people do to browse content related to their interests prior to the internet? They browsed magazines. Magazines came on a monthly and weekly subscription. So we originally set the designated frequency monthly. As a growth leader, I found that way too easy to optimize for. It's just super easy for me to send a push notification to get someone back at least once a month with cool content. So we ended up shifting that to weekly. But this just gives you a framework to start on, what's the action I'm trying to measure and how often should I expect the user to receive it? So when you have these two concepts, then you can actually build a typical retention curve through cohort analysis, right? Where the y-axis is that key action and the x-axis is the designated frequency. It could be days, it could be weeks, it could be months, depending on the natural, frequency of your product. And if you have a product on the path to product market fit, you start to see a graph that looks like this, where the number of people that started using your product, of course, a bunch of people will drop out of the cohort. Even the best products, on the market have people that don't retain. But for a product that has product market fit, you see this flattening out where some people will continue to use the product. And basically, this graph of usage will never cross the x-axis. Eventually, 50 years from now, people will die and stuff. But, if you think on a 10-year time horizon, you see this kind of flat retention curve over time. And that tells you you're delivering core product value consistently for, a certain percentage of the users. In this case, it would be, around 20%, 25%. Of users is where the line flattens. But this is not enough to say that, product market fit. It's just kind of the first step. I've lost my ability to move forward here. Okay, there we go. The second question for product market fit, which is where we're going to spend most of our time on today, is can you grow with the level of retention you have? And normally the way we measure being able to grow is the ability to acquire users and less the amount of money you make from them. And we use the concept of payback period mainly to measure that. So payback period says, hey, if I spend this amount of money to acquire a user, how long does it take me to make that money back in their usage of the product, right? And for early stage startups, you might want to keep that timeline really tight, like a few months. And then as you get bigger, you can extend that to 6 months or maybe a year. Some SaaS companies that have very predictable revenue even go beyond a year payback period, and they're very comfortable with that because they know they'll eventually make it back. Basically, the more history you have, the more risk you can take with payback period. And if you're not making any money, like when I joined Pinterest, you have to be able to use your retained users to grow the number of new users without spending money. So things like paid acquisition and sales are, out of the window. And then you could kind of have this graph that can show both of the things that matter for product market fit on the same graph, which is, do I have a flat retention curve at some level? And is that flat retention curve allowing me to scale new user growth over time, right? And this in particular would be an example of a graph that has a fairly healthy product market fit score, in my opinion. So how do you actually go get some of those new users? We're going to talk about that for a little bit. And there's really two types of growth that people get confused about, in building startups. And I call them Kindle Strategies and Fire Strategies. So the Kindle Strategies are the things you use to get your first users. Mainly what you care about when you're getting your first users is not growth. It's getting just enough users in there to validate if your core product value hypothesis is correct or not. Like, am I bringing in these users and they're finding something of value that they want to stick around? And it allows you to test which audiences, actually are finding that value. Fire strategies are when you've already identified your core product value and you're trying to scale to the broadest audience possible. And unfortunately, at least in the Web2 world, there's only a few strategies that work as fire strategies that could really scale you dramatically into, hundreds of millions of revenue or IPO or whatever that benchmark is. The other thing about Kindle strategies, beyond just bringing in just enough users to measure if your core product value there, is they can also help you unlock a fire strategy that may not be available to you immediately, upon starting the company. So this is an example of this on the right. HipCamp is a company I started working with when they were at the seed stage. And HipCamp knew they wanted to grow bookings on the demand side primarily through SEO. There's a lot of search volume for camping near me or, camping near Yosemite or whatever. And HipCamp's just a marketplace for unique campgrounds. But in order to rank for terms like that, Google has to trust you. And the way Google primarily trusts you is who else links to you and how trustworthy those people that link to you are. So if the New York Times links to you, they're very trustworthy. If my blog links to you, I'm not really as important as the New York Times, so it doesn't matter as much. So what we did at HipCamp is there was a solar eclipse in 2017. We built a landing page that showed you all of the campgrounds you could book that would give you an amazing view of the solar eclipse. And then we spammed every press outlet we could, especially in all of these areas across the US, the story about how to have a great view of the solar eclipse. We got a bunch of people write us up, got a bunch of people link back to us, and then that helped us develop our domain authority, which has now made SEO the primary channel with which HipCamp gets bookings. And now, it's a Series C company. It's much bigger. That strategy of sequencing from a Kindle strategy to a fire strategy, it has worked. Okay. Kindle strategies don't work for very long. When Paul Graham talked about do things that don't scale on his blog, this type of stuff that he's talking about, Kindle strategies either have very limited scale or they're just too expensive to do at dramatic scale. And unlike fire strategies, of which I said, there's just only a few of them that work at scale. A lot of the Kindle strategies we see startups employ are very bespoke. You don't really see them do the same ones across a bunch of ones. Now, paid acquisition is as a counter to that. A lot of people will just buy their first users to validate product market fit and then start to figure out if that's the scalable solution or if there's something else. But you've seen some really weird shit, Airbnb selling cereal or hacking Craigslist. Those were two different things they did that were Kindle strategies. And it's really just focused on, can you do things quickly to get users in? And do they give you some edge in making one of these more scalable strategies possible, mid to long term? So the fire strategies are, the sustainable growth levers, what we at Reforge call growth loops. Like I said, there's really only a couple that tend to work at scale. And, we'll go through all of them. Sales, probably the most common one people think about. And this is effectively when you have a good enough monetization to, put that revenue you're making back into hiring salespeople and paying them commissions and going out and buying leads. And the more revenue you bring in, the more salespeople and leads you can buy, and you can kind of continue to flow that loop. It's never super cheap to be growing via sales, but it is fairly predictable. Paid acquisition is the second one that I think most people are familiar with. And it's got a very similar growth model to sales, except instead of hiring salespeople, you're just focused on taking the extra lifetime value you're getting out of purchases and using that to buy more ads to find more people who also generate lifetime value and completing that process. And this it tends to be a cautionary tale to rely on this entirely for startups, because with paid acquisition, you get Soundgarden has a song called "A Pretty Noose," right? And paid acquisition is a pretty noose because the first time you go target people, you target the best people. They have great conversion rates. They have great activation rates, they have great retention rates, their LTV's through the roof. But then you start reinvesting that and you have to expand the target audience. And then when you expand the target audience, product market fit gets weaker, conversion rate gets a little bit worse, activation rate gets a little bit worse, retention gets a little bit worse, which means your payback period goes up. And then at some point, you may not even have an effective payback period, 5 years from now. And you've seen this with a lot of companies that have gone public. A lot of the SPACs look like this, just total reliance on paid, and now they can't grow profitably anymore. Content is really the one that I've most focused on in my career. And it's also, I think, the least understood. And this is about, you have a volume of content that you can distribute through basically any network larger than yourself to try to expose people to your product in some way that can bring them in to start creating content themselves. SEO is the most common one, like using Google as the network, but you can use any social network, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, whatever, online communities, like Reddit. And you have to just amass a massive amount of content, and you have to be able to distribute it quite effectively, because the conversion rate of people seeing a piece of content, going to your, product, becoming a user and then creating their own content tends to be not that high. So this tends to be the one that takes the longest to start working, but once it starts working, it can be very sustainable. And generally, outside of a few really high monetizing niches like healthcare or like big time enterprise businesses, in order for you to scale content loops as a strategy, you have to get your users to create the content in order to just get enough of it to scale. And this is certainly how Pinterest works, and we'll talk about that. Last but not least, I think the most understood, there's literally a book called Viral Loop. If you want to go deep into it, is virality. And this is, getting users to tell other users about the product, and which means your core flow has to build sharing into it. And you need to focus on figuring out the right incentive to get people to share. Is it they want to look cool? Is it they want to collaborate? Or is it they want to get paid? Those are basically the three. Viral loops tend to grow the fastest, but they tend to, have the shortest lifetime in terms of working, as a fire strategy. So none of these are perfect, but, these are generally the four options, startups have. And this is no longer working. There we go. So, the general thing that I counsel founders on is that you don't want to wait until you have great retention to determine what your fire strategy is going to be. You need to be baking how are you going to grow at scale into your product market fit hypothesis, so that when you're delivering core product value, that second part of the graph starts to take care of itself, either through invites or through user generated content, or through just monetizing really effectively and being able to reinvest that into sales or marketing, right? So don't wait until you have a product that works to figure out how you're going to acquire new users. It might be too late. You might find you need to completely re-architect the product to get the second part of product market fit to work. Which means, in my opinion, quantitative product market fit represents satisfaction that creates sustainable growth. Satisfaction, 9 times out of 10, is going to be measured by retention, that cohort analysis retention curve. And sustainable growth is going to be measured by the effectiveness of an acquisition growth loop that's driving, new users per month up on, a consistent basis. All right. And in my career, generally there's one acquisition loop that drives most of the early growth. So you can see here some examples of companies I've either worked with as an operator or as an advisor. The supply side of marketplaces is almost always sales, right? Paid acquisition, not as much my jam. I did it as a secondary driver at Grubhub, but it wasn't the main driver. But Lyft, company I worked with, it was the main way they acquired supply. And you see a lot of consumer subscription companies acquire supply, and of course TikTok famously spending just billions of dollars on paid acquisition to grow its network. Content being the primary way, as an operator and both as an advisor, I help companies drive growth. So you can see a lot of the companies I've worked with as an advisor, this has been the main thing they've used to drive growth. Most of the time, this just ends up being through SEO on Google, but not always. And then virality, people think of it mostly as like a consumer social lever, but you can see here a couple of examples where like in Fray used virality in B2B, which is really interesting. Lyft used to incentivize referrals, to drive, demand as well. Okay, so what's it look like to work on one of these loops? So this is the example of the Pinterest growth loop that I helped build. So when when Pinterest started growing, it grew mainly on top of Facebook by you signing up with a Facebook account. And anytime you saved content, it would be distributed to your Facebook feed and all your friends would see it. They would click on the content and then they would sign up for Pinterest. And then Facebook turns the open graph off and Pinterest stops growing. So this is when Pinterest brought me in and they said, hey, Casey, we think SEO is going to be the lever that's going to work for us, but we don't know anything about SEO. And I'm like, cool, I got you. Like did this at apartments.com, did this at Grubhub. And this is the loop we built, which is we take the Pinterest content, which was primarily boards created by users on different topics. Could be wedding dresses, it could be men's fashion, whatever. We distribute those to Google. We get them to start ranking for when people are typing in, Chukka boots or Mehendi wedding ideas, whatever. We then allow users to see a free preview of all that content. But as they start scrolling or as they start clicking into images, we block them and ask them to sign up to see more. Because you're not really getting the true Pinterest value prop by just browsing one topic of interest. Then as you sign up, we activate the user with relevant content related to their interest, and we allow them to get the extension that allows them to save other content from the internet. And then that does two things. When people see a feed of content related to their interest and they start saving things, it gives Pinterest more signal on the content that works. And when they start saving new content from outside the internet, it gives Pinterest just more content, both of which improve the content that we can show to Google and its users to drive more users. And this has now been the primary driver of growth of Pinterest for 7, 8 years now. But we had to build it from scratch in 2014. Eventbrite, somewhat similar, still what I would call a content loop, but a little bit different in that an event creator comes to Eventbrite and they create an event listing page of an event they're going to host, in the real world. The creator then goes and does a bunch of their own marketing to share that event with potential people who are interested and bring them to Eventbrite to transact. And if they're successful at doing that, they will sell tickets. Consumers will attend the event. And then, wow, it turns out a lot of those consumers end up becoming event creators themselves and hosting future events on Eventbrite. And then also with this, middle arrow indicates is when creators are effective at selling tickets, they tend to come back and they put on more events. So this was the primary way Eventbrite grew in the early days. So a different form of a content loop. So when you think about growth in loops, it really changes the way you approach growth inside an organization. Because I would say when people are thinking about growth in terms of more dated concepts like funnels, they tend to just focus on the top. Like, how do I get new acquisition channels? How do I get more users? But when you model loops, you realize it's the retention of the users that matter, as better retention makes every way that you acquire new users easier. So if you're retaining more users and you primarily acquire via sales, then you have better lifetime value to reinvest in lead gen and hiring more sales rep. For paid, you have better lifetime value, which allows you to invest in more ads and have a more effective payback period. If you are primarily going through content, the retained users just create more content, which means you have more distribution of content to bring in new users. And for virality, retained users have more opportunities to invite or refer, others. So it literally all of these retention just makes everything easier. And generally, the biggest lever to improving retention is onboarding. So I would say when I talk with startups, they typically think retention is driven by adding new features that make the product more valuable. And I would say the opposite is generally true. Frequently, that just makes the product more complicated and harder for new users to understand, and therefore they activate worse over time because it's harder to figure out what the core product value is. So 9 times out of 10, reducing friction through making it easier to connect to the product initially is the biggest retention win you can find, and something that I've worked with dozens of startups on at this point. So what's actually the job of onboarding? And I think this is something that a lot of startups get wrong. The job of onboarding is to get users to retain long-term. So if we go back to this graph earlier and we separate the people who churn out of the system and the people who actually onboard effectively, right? Onboarding's job is to get you to the point where you stop losing people in the dark or blue, right? Where you get that people who are going to continue to go and use the product on whatever time period makes the most sense. So we had a third concept to the product market fit graph that we talked about earlier, Just not only do we have the y-axis, which is the key action, and the x-axis, which is the designated frequency, we also have this like retention interval, which is how long does it take to tell if someone's going to build a habit? And you basically, in this graph, it's when you stop seeing any more dark blue, over time. We call the time when people realize they're going to continue to use this thing and they've already built a habit, the habit moment. And we define that with a habit metric, which is what in our data allows us to tell that the person has built a habit and is going to continue to use, this product, regularly. And if you're trying to get as many people as possible to this habit metric, you have to work backwards to what's the right product experience that's going to get them to reliably build a habit. So generally, the first thing you do is you try to figure out, well, if there's a habit around doing the key action at the designated frequency, how do I get them to do that the first time? And, we call that the aha moment as measured by the aha metric. And then you can work backward from that and say, what work does the user and the product need to do to most reliably give a good chance that a new user will experience the aha moment? And we call that the setup moment and the setup metric. And I'll, explain how, you use these concepts in practice. So let's take Pinterest. So, the typical like funnel based approach to this problem would be you bring in traffic. Like in our case, we started bringing it in from Google, and Pinterest wanted to activate people mostly on mobile. So we tried to get app downloads. Then you try to get people to sign up, and none of that is like, onboarding quite yet. What was happening after sign up when I joined Pinterest is we were connecting you with friends and with influencers and then showing you the content that they saved. And that worked really great when all the people you were acquiring were moms in the Midwest. It did not work great when you were acquiring, people on the coast, people in different genders, people in different countries. The content relevance just wasn't working out. So we switched the model to have people tell us what topics they were interested in. Then we focused the first user experience on teaching them, how to save and get them to their first save. That became the aha metric. And if you saved in the 4th week, we knew you would save in the 5th, 6th, 125th, like you had built the habit of using Pinterest to find, cool content related to your interests. So once you know, like using your data and running some experiments, what the habit metric is, then you actually have to optimize the experience. And this was the experience that you got when you signed up for Pinterest when I joined the company. You can see there's a lot going on here. It's not really that clear what you're supposed to do. There's a bunch of different content related to different topics. You can invite friends, you can find friends. There's all sorts of metadata. So one of the things we just started doing is like simplifying this experience pretty dramatically. So, hey, turns out friends is not the best way to find interesting content. So let's delete that. Well, it turns out we shouldn't be asking you to invite friends until you're activated. So let's delete that. And finding friends is not the best way to find interesting content. So we should delete that module. These are outdated concepts. Then thinking about attribution of where pins came from, it's a little bit too early to explain that when we haven't explained how to save content to boards. So we should be removing that from the experience. We also should be removing pin descriptions because the main thing that attracts people to activating is just seeing cool images related to their topics of interest. And attribution from like the websites and metadata from the insights is interesting, and Rose Byrne's cute and all, but that's actually not Rose Byrne. So we had some major issues related to the quality of some of our data, and we shouldn't be showing wrong data to users because that prevents people from activating. So all of this stuff we just deleted from the product, and we raised the activation rate as a result of keeping the product more focused on what got people to actually build a habit of using us. And one of the things we realized in doing that is that our mobile app activated at 3x the rate of the website. So whenever people were coming in from mobile web, we just pushed them to the app as aggressively as possible. And we started with the way Apple recommends, which, by the way, is the worst converting variant we've ever tested. So what Apple recommends turns out is not a good idea. Then we shifted to a full page takeover with our value prop and how we had high ratings. with kind of what the product looks like in the background. And then we just kept iterating, kept running more A/B tests. So then it's like, okay, let's use animated GIFs related to the content you're about to see. Let's change the CTA to continue instead of download. Let's make it a header that you can scroll past and actually see all the content on the board. And then when you click on the content, we'll push you to the app. And then this is, kind of became like the more dominant version where it's like a representation of what a board looks like, A/B tested copy, A/B tested imagery, A/B tested CTAs, all of which had massive improvements on the amount of people that actually, got the app, which was a better converting experience. But then we ran into a bunch of issues, with once people got the app, there were a bunch of conversion issues that were preventing them from experiencing the value. So before we used to ask you, to, sign up and give you a bunch of information. So the first thing we tested was splitting that into steps and giving a progress bar to show that it wasn't that much effort. And this improved, conversion rate to completing sign up. And then we started trying to get more information that would help us activate better, like knowing your gender, helps us improve activation rate. Then we started seeing if we could consolidate these fields. So we could pick up your email address automatically using Android permissions, things like that. We redesigned this flow based on what we were learning from the mobile app, from the mobile web experiments, and that had higher conversion rate. And then we got to a point where we're just dramatically able to shrink the amount of steps. So we went from 5 steps to 3, where 2 of them are actually not required. Like you cannot give us your gender or not give us your age. And we will pick up your email address automatically. We'll pick up your name automatically by reading the contact list. And then we'll just get you right into the hard step, which is picking 5 topics. Then we know that we have cool content to show you that's going to give you a high chance of activating into a retained user. So this is a ton of A/B testing. Once you know your growth loop, optimizing every step to get it to turn as fast as possible. And for us, all the biggest experiments were in onboarding. We could probably spend an hour on the SEO experiments or things like that as well. But this is really where the biggest impact tends to happen. We also started removing distractions on the mobile experience. So removing, descriptions, getting more content in the flow, removing, footers that we had in the experience, all sorts of things like that, just to keep it really focused on showing you cool content related to your interest. But we did add some education to make it really clear on how to use the product effectively, which is really scrolling, tapping, and saving content. So that actually pulses around the save CTA button. We actually changed that. It used to say pin it. And then we did a test changing it to say save. And that alone was a 15% improvement in activation rate. So it's not like all of these are major overhauls. Sometimes it's just really thinking about how to make it very clear for the user what to do in the next step. Okay, so what happens from all of this type of work? You understand what your growth loop is, you've got it working, you're tracking people, and now you want to optimize it. Well, in this case, we were able to double the activation rate from sign up to retain users in a 1.5 years through all of this work. And that's a bunch of the experiments I just showed you. Experiments I could show you also would show how we 5x'd conversion rate on the web. The other things I showed you today is how we, improved mobile conversion rate from download to sign up by 30%. So once you really understand what your growth loop is and what the constraints are, you can just iterate endlessly on it to continue to improve the metrics and continue to grow, quicker and quicker. It's not always, this easy, right? You're going to find points where you just can't move activation rate higher. You can't get any more traffic and you're going to need to think about, other growth loops. And there's certainly examples, of that from Pinterest and Eventbrite. But this is more like what an early stage growth team works on. You find the growth loop that works, and then you're a dog with a bone and you just grind on it. You run a bunch of experiments, you improve every step of the loop, and you'll be surprised at how much better you can grow as a business, right? And this basically has fueled Pinterest growth from 40 million to over 500 million users. So at that point, I'm like, okay, I got all this onboarding stuff figured out, right? I've done so many experiments. I know how to optimize conversion. I know how to optimize, retention rates. And then I joined Eventbrite. And Eventbrite's a very, very different beast. So with Pinterest, it's a consumer product. And with a consumer product, a lot of times people are coming in with not very high intent, right? They don't know what it is. They'll check it out. If it's cool, they'll stick around. If it's not, they'll bail, right? And Pinterest in particular, it's a very hard product to describe. So really, we just want you to get in and experience it, because then it personalizes and you start seeing more cool stuff. So everything you saw in all these experiments is around, how do we remove friction that prevents people from experiencing the product value, but add friction if we know we're unlikely to show you the real product value if we don't get it, like, making people pick topics. So, the core thesis was, get to the product value as fast as possible, but not faster. Like if you're skipping steps that can prevent people from seeing something cool, don't skip those. That'll just drop activation rate. Eventbrite, we're mainly acquiring businesses, and these are very small businesses. They're, events businesses, but they are businesses. They're more rational. They know what problem they're looking to solve, and they are willing to spend more time learning a product to see if they can solve it. So at Eventbrite, we don't hyper focus on removing like every possible step of friction from the process. We more so focus on how do we communicate all the value in a way that's sequenced to understanding, why they should stick around and continue to use this product and run their events business on it, right? So on the time to get people to, the aha moment or even the habit moment, Eventbrite's kind of in the middle on the scale. And on the right of the scale, you have your super enterprise companies where, you're selling to hyper rational big business. They're willing to potentially spend 6 months of investment before they actually start seeing the value, right? And this is, how a lot of enterprise sales works, right? It takes a while to implement. It takes a while to get the sale done, all of that kind of stuff. So what you want to try to understand is where's your product on this spectrum? Are you hyper consumer like Pinterest, where it's like, get them into the product value as soon as possible, understand the few constraints you need to add so that they're actually going to activate? Are you more like an enterprise business where like you're going to sell on the dream? It might take 6 months to a year to achieve the dream, but you're going to have champions inside the company that back that and push you all the way to the end. Or are you somewhere in the middle, like Eventbrite, which is, more of your classic PLG SaaS sort of growth model, even though it's actually not SaaS, which we could talk about, where, you've got time, but you don't have infinite time to really show that you can help, your customers, grow, be more successful, happier, all that kind of stuff. So it's an important thing to think about, as you build your companies. Where do you feel like you are? Because your approaches to the onboarding of your product are going to change. How much humans are involved is going to change, right? How many steps and how much time it's going to take to activate is all going to change based on this info. So, okay. Totally down for kind of the next phase of the process and Q&A. If you want to dive deeper in this stuff, I have a whole 6-week course on Reforge on, retention and engagement that deals into effective onboarding, and also a course called Advanced Growth Strategy, which talks about how to build growth loops. So if you want to dig into that in way more depth, obviously head over to Reforge, but I'm also happy to take questions now and, anything I discussed.
Thank you so much, Casey. That was awesome.
There we go.
Chat has been going wild with questions, which we'll definitely get to if you're able to go over the top of the hour a little bit. So I think let's prioritizing and grouping together some of the clusters of questions. I think a big theme of the presentation here was about how to get users to the aha moment more quickly, or how retention is kind of dependent on sustainable satisfaction, that users are getting some sort of value that they want from a product. I think a lot of the founders in this particular Zoom chat are really, really early, and perhaps at an even earlier stage of their businesses, where they're still trying to identify what is the key action in my product that I'm trying to drive users towards. And there's hypotheses there, but they might not know conclusively. And so is there advice that you would offer to really early stage founders who have yet to really crystallize their product market fit, in terms of how you explore the potential pathways of how to get there, how to even identify the key action? And maybe this draws on some of your experiences at Eventbrite too, where you experienced those uncertain market conditions and were forced to pivot the product in a complete action.
Yeah. So I will cover it for different business models and then talk about like the Eventbrite case in particular. So there's really three different pieces of advice I give depending on the type of business you're building on the path to product market fit. So I have a post I wrote on like generally the two frameworks of product market fit that are most popular in the world, which is like, for better or worse, I call the Eric Ries model and the Keith Rabois model, and both of them have pros and cons. I'm not religious about either one of them being like correct. But let's break it down by business model. So if you are building an enterprise company, congratulations, you picked the easy path to building a startup. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it means the playbook is just most developed in terms of the path to product market fit, right? Which is you get your teeth into some type of archetype customer, right? You try to understand every problem they're having. You start to see which problems potentially there are better software solutions for. You start building them, testing them, and getting them to a point where that customer is excited, to pay for that. And then you hopefully are doing that with a customer that's representative of a much larger base, right? And in that case, you're just going to look, at, how much money you're making versus the cost of sales and the retention of those customers. It's a fairly simple model. Doesn't mean there's not a lot of hard work involved, but like founders are generally less confused about where they are in the process. And then when you move that into like more PLG SaaS, which is like, I want the product to grow rather than like, handshakes and steak dinners, then still the model is fairly similar. You're just generally using something else besides enterprise sales as the acquisition lever. You need to have a great self-serve product onboarding flow instead of like manual training. Those people either need to be creating content that they share with their teammates, or they need to be paying you a bunch of money because you've got like a great freemium model that gets them to a paying model very quickly. So you're just trying to see like, okay, what sort of features am I building that people start to use regularly? Which ones are they not using regularly? Why are they not? And you run this kind of data plus qualitative research, loop on as many customers as possible. And, Dropbox and Slack were kind of the first couple of companies that done that. And now, people have built that into more of a playbook, like the Notions, the Airtables of the world, et cetera. So that's starting to become a lot more common. Then when you move into marketplaces, oh shit, things get a lot harder. Because you're actually building product for two customers at the same time, supply and demand. But there's still a playbook here, which is you're trying to understand what's the shape of the network you're trying to build. Is it local? Is it category specific? In the case of like Whatnot, just started with Funko Pops as their initial market. Grubhub obviously started in one neighborhood in Chicago. And then you have to understand how much supply do I need in the market to create a reliable product for demand. So in the case of, Grubhub, I need 50 restaurants to be able to have enough variety for people to come in and have a high enough conversion ordering food and retaining into ordering food regularly. And then once you build that, then you're building kind of a repeatable playbook of how do I get to 50 restaurants? How do I expose those 50 restaurants to enough users that the restaurants are going to stick around? Turns out in our case, the restaurants needed 2 orders a day to feel like it was valuable enough. So that became an easy benchmark. So you're just trying to like map the shape of the network effect. You're going to get like a really clear metric on supply, really clear metric on demand that indicates product market fit, which mostly we call liquidity in marketplaces. And then you're like, how do I stamp that across categories or across geographies to expand, right? So hard generally takes longer to find product market fit than most enterprise companies or PLG SaaS companies, but a more durable form of product market fit because it'll be network powered once you find it. And then last but not least is consumer, more like social products or consumer single player products. And, I'd rethink your life decisions if you decided to start a company in one of those spaces, because dear God, it is impossible. I just wrote a post on consumer subscription and why that's so incredibly difficult. If you want to dig into that concept, but consumer social is worse because with consumer social, the value prop is network based. But there's also something you're doing inside the network. So in order to validate your core product value hypothesis, you have to go not only launch the product to a certain number of people, you have to guess who's the right people and what's the right size of network. And then when it doesn't work, you are not sure if you launched to the wrong people, if you have the wrong value prop, or if you have all those things right and you just don't have enough people to consistently expose the value prop to create, a habit formation. So generally what consumer social founders do is they either have a really strong hypothesis on the target market, like, Evan Spiegel at Snap, right? Was like, he was a USC student at the time. He knew exactly who he was building for, right? Or they go really big on network to try to make sure that they're not going to lose based on the network size being wrong. And then it's really just testing, core product value or target audience. So you're seeing this play out right now with Threads, right? Threads is launched inside a massive company, of course, in Meta. And they're like, YOLO, we're just going to launch it. We're going to have 100 million people sign up. 80 million or something are going to churn because the product doesn't have product market fit for them. And through 100 million people of various shapes and sizes trying it, we're going to hopefully see some that we find product market fit with. We'll understand from the 80 million that churn why we didn't have product market fit, and we could decide if we want to expand the product to those use cases over time. Obviously, you're not going to replicate that strategy because you don't have 2 billion Instagram customers to spam for free like they do. But it's just really hard to parse out these different elements of your product market fit hypothesis to understand like which one's off. Like Clubhouse thought they had it and they went big, and then they went too big with the network and it ruined the product market fit, in my opinion, and they've never recovered. So, generally not my favorite business to start, even though I've led growth at one of them before. But there's just these different questions that you have to run through in terms of the playbook based on the business model you're trying to build. Okay, so that was the first part of the question. Second part of the question was Eventbrite. So there's a couple parts of the story, right? So for those of you who are not familiar, I joined Eventbrite 9 months before the pandemic. And I knew it was a turnaround situation. The company was not growing fast enough to be considered a growth company on the public markets. And it was primarily my job to fix that. So, at first you're kind of auditing everything that's being done by the current team, less relevant for founders. But in my opinion, like there's a lot of stuff that shouldn't be done. There was a lot of saying yes to ideas, not a lot of being focused and saying no to the right ideas. So right around the time I get really good at auditing all of that and understanding, what parts of the strategy make sense, what part of the strategy don't make sense. The pandemic hits and revenue goes below zero, which didn't even know was possible. But that's when you're processing more refunds than transactions per day. And this is because, every country you operated in had made live events illegal. And online events was less than 1% of revenue at the time. So fortunately for me, it was enough time to know exactly what was wrong with our initial strategy and what we should focus on for the long term. But of course, there's a lot of shiny new objects in that period of time. Hopin had raised $1 bajillion. Meta, Google, Amazon were all coming out with these online event products. Our online event revenue is obviously going through the roof. So a lot of people wanted us to just become an online events company. And I think from my perspective, I was like, look, this is hot right now, but assuming we all die from the pandemic, we will eventually go outside again. And when we do that, this market will still be a very tiny subset of the in-person event market. And not really play to our core competencies because we don't know anything about video historically as a 14-year-old events company. And it'll be a pretty impressive competitive landscape that we'd be competing against if that market is durable, right? Obviously, well-funded startups as well as big incumbents, jumping into the fray. So just didn't see a path for victory there. And so as we looked at some other things that were showing promise, like helping event creators get better with their own marketing and building out more of a marketplace where we're driving more of the demand directly instead of the creator doing their own marketing to drive demand, we thought those were things that played more to our core competencies better, that were eventually going to be larger markets than online events, and be less competitive than online events. So, to the dismay of some people inside my team, we went and bet on the world returning to live events eventually. We'll make some online event revenue, in the interim, but we'll just integrate with Zoom instead of build our own thing. And, that's turned out to be the correct strategy. Eventbrite's now been cash flow positive for 6 straight quarters and is growing, healthily. But there were some dangerous moments in between. So that's not necessarily replicable for US startup founders, right? Because I had, 14 years of data. I had the knowledge of everything that was being worked on and what was actually helping drive growth versus not drive growth. I had millions of customers to talk to. And, we mined all of that. And I wrote that document in a day. I wrote that document on a Saturday and shared it with, the CEO and the rest of the executive team on a Sunday. We started pitching it to private equity that Monday. So we didn't have time to debate, for multiple months over what the strategy needed to be, nor do you all as founders generally, right? But it wasn't that in one day I figured out what to do. It's that for 9 months I'd been learning about the business, and it became crunch time, and we were ready to make the right calls.
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So kind of based on the data, formulating a lot of hypotheses, also gathering information about the competitive landscape, all of that led to a kind of data-driven, but also partially intuition-driven decision about where to go with the product.
Yep.
I want to switch gears. So there's also a vein of questions that have been asked about tokens, which I will sort of up level into your thoughts on financial incentives as it relates to growth and sustaining retention. Obviously, that has worked to great effect, but not sustainably in a lot of Web3 networks. And so I guess the question is how effective are financial incentives in generating growth, and can that last? And what would your advice be there?
Yeah. So I think, a lot of my peers in growth, and certainly in the VC community, I'm sure you saw this, Lee, were like, oh my God, crypto solves acquisition problems because we can just incentivize users with, virtual currency that didn't exist before to motivate them not only to, retain, try, but also bring other people into the fold. And I think I was always like, yeah, if only it were that easy. Because if you incentivize to product market fit, you did not get to product market fit, because part of evaluating product market fit is evaluating, price to value, and incentives change that dramatically in a way that isn't sustainable 3, 6 months, 12 months down the line. So generally, my advice to founders is you want to pull incentives out of the core product value hypothesis, because as soon as saving money or making money becomes part of the core product value hypothesis, it will subsume everything else. So we saw this at Grubhub, right? If you gave a discount on first order, the value prop became saving money on food rather than ordering food online, which is what we really wanted the value prop to be. So we did not incentivize first order. A lot of our competitors did. And what do you know? We found that they had retention rates that were half of what ours were. It's just not a good way to sell and what you generally want the value prop to be, which is not, money related. Incentives are really useful, potentially to get people to the habit moment, to get people to try something that's kind of scary, but then the core value prop is strong enough to stand on its own after an initial experience, or to increase the engagement of people who already have some form of habit built. So some of the things we did at Grubhub, which are relevant here, are, we built a game that you played after every third order that gave you a 1 in 4 chance of winning free food. And it was unbelievably profitable, because people that were using Grubhub occasionally, but not for every time they ordered food, switched all of their ordering to Grubhub so that they could play the game more. And the game was a variable reward game. So you could win everything from as small as a free drink to free food for a year. And, there's some core psychology hypothesis in here, which is, what are you doing after you order food? It turns out a whole lot of nothing until the food shows up. So we had this captive audience to do something with. We decided to create a game because of the unit economics of Grubhub. And it worked out, really well in terms of driving more engagement. So I think financial incentives to drive things that are valuable to the company, that you can model out and A/B test, unbelievably good. So financially incentivized referrals have worked very scalably as a solution for a lot of marketplaces, DoorDash, Uber, Lyft, etc. Nothing wrong with that. You know exactly what the payback period is going to be. You can measure what the retention rate and therefore LTV from those channels look like to make sure you're building a profitable transaction, which is what all of us in the growth community do. And for driving deeper engagement into the product, like we could incentivize people to order sushi, which is a higher ticket item at Grubhub. And when we did that, and they tried sushi for the first time, everyone loves sushi and they end up ordering it more often, which means they order more frequently and their average order size goes up, which, makes Grubhub more money. So all those things are really great. I just be really careful about your introduction to the product, incorporating some sort of incentive or discount, because it can tend to block them from focusing on like what the core product value is. And this is like my biggest critique of, the Web3 community in general, right? Is like when you're incentivizing every internet transaction, you have no idea when someone's talking about something, if they actually care about it, or if they think they're just going to make, a rake on it. And that's a big challenge for founders that are trying to involve tokens in bootstrapping the network. So I think, the thesis probably 5 years ago was like, oh, all marketplaces are going to become, crypto incentivized because it's a way to get to liquidity faster. And I think now probably the vibe is the opposite. Like you're actually going to get faux traction. And then you're going to have like this impossible task of figuring out, like, do you actually have core product value being delivered on both sides of the marketplaces, at once you've got like on paper what looks like scale.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of the narrative and the desire among founders that I've seen has shifted from using financial incentives to just getting users to sign up for a product to try it and for, at the beginning, to deploying tokens in a really targeted way to enhance retention or get users to build a habit for people who are already intrinsically interested in using something. So I think we did a session with Andrew earlier this cohort, and he had this great quote, which I think really applies here, which is like the laws of physics are the same. The use of financial incentives can really subsume a lot of users' motivations if deployed too generously or ahead of time prematurely. And so anyways, I think tokens are sort of converging to how financial incentives have been deployed in Web2 contexts.
Yeah, I'll give one quick story there, which is when we were Series D at Grubhub, we acquired a competitor, Campus Food. I say competitor, but really they were in a bunch of these college towns that we weren't in yet. So it's about accelerating our geographic expansion. And for Grubhub, if you ordered a second time within the first month, we knew you were going to retain, basically. And, then I started doing the due diligence on Campus Food, and they have this complicated model on like, oh, it used to be 3 orders, and then we incentivized to get to the third order. And then it moved to 5 orders, and we incentivized to 5 orders. And then we incentivized getting out 7 orders. And it's like, you are never going to solve this problem because like incentives is just like the wrong solution. You're just delaying proving out whether they're going to stick around and pay full price, right? So we canceled a lot of that stuff once we acquired them, right? And that's the thing with incentives do. It can kind of kick the can down the road on actually like proving out your real hypothesis on if you have, a great business or profitable economics, whatever the case may be.
That makes sense. Carson had a great question about product onboarding. Carson, do you want to unmute and ask it?
I know you had been essentially said like reducing the friction in onboarding is good for enabling retention, but then later you were also talking about like some friction is good because it gets people invested and like feels like they've put time in. Yes. So how do you kind of balance simplifying the onboarding, but then also you're essentially having people uninvested and it makes them easy to offboard?
So in Reforge, we have the concept of good friction versus bad friction, right? So bad friction is things that makes it harder for a person to get to the product value, and going through them doesn't materially raise the product value that can get created. And good friction is like, oh, it actually prevents them from moving forward. But if they go through that step, it raises the chances that when they get to the core product value, they're going to actually like the experience and stick around. So there's a good blog post. It's actually on Andrew Chen's blog, but it's not written by Andrew Chen. It's written by this guy, Darius Contractor, who was at Dropbox at the time. It's called the Psyched Framework. And what they use the Dropbox is basically like trying to measure on every step of onboarding, is it raising intent or dropping intent? And you could get some really curious results when you apply this framework. Like Stitch Fix is famous for having like 50 steps, when they're onboarding, but they barely lose any one of those steps because the user sees the impact of giving them more information and trust in that building, ultimately a better recommendation on, what fashion that they're going to be shipped, right? So you can measure all of this, in your product to see if it's really creating good friction or bad friction. And then you can qualitatively test it. Like something we just did endlessly is we brought someone in, we said, get Pinterest on your phone, sign up, go through the experience. And we just saw what brought them joy and didn't bring them joy. And, we would then go make changes based on, what we saw. And that, like, I spent a lot of, one particular year at Pinterest flying to Brazil, to France, flying to Germany, and watch people use our product and just fail. And then go back and make a bunch of changes based on, what we saw. And that's what allowed us to have like a really successful, international expansion, because like it just wasn't working when I got there. Like international users were not retaining. So there's a mixture of kind of the quant and the qual there, right? But you're trying to build that intuition, as a team, right? Of like, is this good friction or bad friction right now? Like, is it raising their intent? Is it raising the value that we can create, as a product, because we now have this information on them, or not? If it's not, get rid of it. And then if you're with a group of people, if you're acquiring a group of people that's very patient and very rational, you just don't obsess of it as much, right? Like for Eventbrite, like I'm not trying to shave seconds off a sign-up flow like I was at Pinterest, because it just doesn't move the needle that much. But at Pinterest, I mean, it equates to tens of millions of users. So it's just different math.
Nico had a question about the strategy of shifting from a Kindle strategy to a more sustainable growth strategy. Nico, did you want to unpack that question anymore?
Absolutely. I was wondering, like, pretty much how to pivot your Kindle strategy to, or like, when do you know it's you've tried it enough, and then you need to change to a different strategy, and maybe also tied a little bit to a product, like when you're still trying to find product market fit, like how to change like a feature to fit to that.
So when you're still trying to validate that you're building the right core product experience, you're really only getting enough users in just to see if you're further along the path of delivering concrete product value to as many users as possible, right? So that's where you generally want to be constrained. Obviously there's cases like Threads where they haven't done that, and that's the right strategy for a very big company like Meta, but generally not the right for startups. But yeah, you're basically trying to like just start to see if like the product even works, if people like it. You're probably talking to as many of those people on the phone as possible to get like all their opinions, like all that kind of stuff. And when you get much more confident in it's really valuable, and the quantitative way to look at that is the retention curves. But if you're hitting product market fit early, you're not going to have 12 months of data. You're just going to see that like, oh, they came back week over week at a really high rate or whatever like that. And you're going to project if it's like flattening out at a good rate. That's what's going to make you start to think about like, okay, now my Kindle strategies need to be helping me sequence toward true product market fit, which means I have a scalable acquisition loop that can power my company. So, right, in that case of HipCamp, it's like, okay, cool. I'm going to need enough links that I can rank on the first page of Google for camping near me, right? In the case of Airbnb, it's like I need enough supply with a high enough conversion rate that I can go pay for users, on AdWords that are searching for vacation rentals. So there's this clear kind of bar usually you're trying to get above, right? In the case of HipCamp, it's ranking on the first page of Google. It needs more links to do that, and it needs more inventory to do that. In the case of Airbnb, it needs inventory and it needs conversion rates to be able to make AdWords work with a profitable payback period. And now they don't even do AdWords. which is kind of like a famous thing from Chesky. They canceled all that stuff. But early on, there's a lot of AdWords spent for Airbnb. So there's that kind of different model. Marketplaces, 9 out of 10 times, it's like, how do I get enough supply where the demand side product feels great? Thumbtack is like the 1 out of 10 where they actually went demand first, and then they just sent the leads to suppliers to try to get them on the platform and buy the leads. But 9 out of 10 are going to go supply first. So yeah, generally there's some sort of hump you're trying to use to get sales, paid marketing, content, your virality to work. Virality has the most math on it, probably published on the internet. Rahul Vora from Superhuman has some amazing posts on how to do that math that are still out there somewhere. I'm sure we can link them at some point. Paid in sales is just kind of like, all in payback period calculations. Like, and again, they don't need to be perfect at Series A, but they need to be on a path to being in a relatively good spot. Well, maybe today they need to be perfect. Lee can tell you what VCs care about today. But historically, it's more like, are you projected to have really healthy returns on your paid acquisition or your sales channel? It doesn't need to be, perfect out the gate. And then content, like I said, it's the hardest because usually you need a ton of inventory if you're Grubhub or Airbnb, or a ton of boards if you're Pinterest, which means you need to be doing something else until you trip some threshold that, the content starts to take over as the primary driver of new users.
Thanks.
Casey, is there a rule of thumb for how healthy your retention should be, or what level it should flatten at as a product builder for you to then switch gears and say, like, I have product market fit, now I can focus on growth? Yeah.
So the rule of thumb, which is probably not super helpful to answer your question, is if the curve flattens at a high enough level where the engagement from those users, either the money you're making or the content they're creating or the invites they're sending, is driving new user growth sustainably up, you're there. That could be at 5%, that could be at 65%. So just in social, you can see the disparity. Twitter's activation rate historically was 18%. I would consider that god awful. Turns out it does not matter because the press talks about them every single day. So their acquisition costs have been zero forever. And the ubiquity with which you hear about this product is just could not be higher. And it's been that way for over a decade, right? So Twitter was able to sign up basically the entire internet, churn 4 out of 5, and still have, a few hundred million DAU business to be able to create an ad business around. And it's still TBD if that's going to be a sustainable business, but like on paper, that should work out. Instagram was 65%. So efficient, right? Activated the majority of the people that signed on to the product. And as a result, has grown a lot faster and more sustainably, than Twitter, able to hit, well over 1 billion, daily active users, right? And is, valued much more than Twitter and all that kind of stuff. Pinterest is in between. Pinterest 45%. So very good compared to Twitter. Like cool story, bro, to Instagram, right? So turns out that's a $20 billion company with a 45% activation rate and basically, no acquisition costs on the demand side. So because the content loop is really strong at Pinterest, 45% is plenty. Because the type of people that activate on Twitter are so influential in reaching everyone else, 18%, it turns out, was good enough. Should they have focused on getting it higher? Of course they should have. And they did try. They just never really were able to unlock the activation problem on that network. I would say take those outliers out. Generally, you don't really see anyone below a 25% activation rate be able to scale to $1 billion in revenue. So in consumer subscription, you're generally thinking you need to be, at least in the US, you need to be above 50, maybe even 60% annual retention, meaning people are paying you for a second year. And very few companies have done that, right? Like Amazon's done that. Spotify's done that. Netflix has done that. Duolingo probably did for a long time, but it's dipped below that. Calm got above that for a while. Not sure where they are at today. So depending on the model and how much it costs you to acquire users, these numbers, will change. Pinterest and Twitter have never needed to spend $1, so they could potentially get away with lower rates. Consumer subscription apps, which tend to rely on paid acquisition, need the number to be a lot higher, or else paid acquisition just starts to become upside down on unit economics, at scale.
Right. That makes sense. Okay, I think we have time for probably a couple more questions. So Blake had a really excellent question about content as a growth strategy. Blake, do you want to unmute and ask that?
Sure. So you just mentioned during the presentation that you're kind of a particular expert in content. And so I was curious if you could share some of your learnings around, content strategy specifically for small companies if they're getting started with a content strategy from the ground up.
Yeah. So, normally I would have told people in the past, content's a great second growth loop. It's not really a great first one because it can just take too long. And then once it starts working, it's kind of hard to fuck up. I would say I've changed my view in that in particular, Google has made it easier for startups to compete over the last few years. In that now, domain authority, which used to be a concept of just kind of the quantity and quality of other websites that link to you, has been a bit replaced by like micro authority on a per topic basis. So what startups can now do, which they weren't able to do in the past, is really focus on a particular niche and have really amazing content. It could be user generated, it could be company generated. But if you really focus on nailing a particular piece of a particular topic and get all the adjacent topics covered really well, you can actually start to develop like a successful SEO strategy a lot earlier in your life cycle than, maybe 2014 when I joined Pinterest. We've seen some startups, do this. I have some angel investments that I've worked on that have done this. And either it's a niche topic or a new topic that people couldn't have been searching for 10 years because it has been around for 10 years. Like AI is probably the most prominent recent example. Or there's just a genuine care to the topic that didn't previously exist. So some things that, or you're leveraging some other form of authority that helps with like engagement rate signals from Google. So like Masterclass is a recent example of this, in that like, they go work with Serena Williams or, like the top most important person, in whatever that topic is. And then they write like content as if it's written by her. So people are going to trust that a lot more, even if the domain authority isn't there. So they've leveraged that into like, there's a Gordon Ramsay post on chicken recipes. Did Gordon Ramsay actually write that post? No. But it's Gordon Ramsay sponsored and it's really in depth. And they've been able to, make that a part of their growth model in a way where they were just kind of all paid before. And I think you see this in because what Google's trying to do is Google's trying to say like, okay, it used to be you search this topic, you search this keyword. What are, the websites that talk about that keyword the most and have the highest domain authority? And then there's like some, math calculation to what shows up first. And now it's more like, okay, Blake, you searched this keyword. Here's the universe of things I know are related. And then which page covers the entire topic of related things and what was searched best is going to be what shows up, right? So that means, I think if someone's searching coupons, they actually care about coupons and how long it takes to ship and shipping price and related products and all this kind of other stuff, right? So the people that cover all of that on a page rank better than, just the highest domain authority free coupon site or whatever. So that stuff is starting to change, which is good for startups. Now, of course, you have AI disruption in the search results, which could be bad for startups as well. So we'll have to see how all of that plays out. But I think generally, if you focus on how do I build core product value where the output of that core product value is the user creates content that they're proud of, that's really interesting. It's really interesting for B2B and it's really interesting for B2C because they might do some sharing of it B2B inside their company, like the Notions and, Airtables of the world, B2C to their friends or post to social media. And on top of that, you might be able to get it indexed on Google. Those are kind of different strategies that tend to not be as well known that have played out really well.
Awesome. Thanks.
A follow-up question to that, Casey, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how sustainable SEO is as a strategy, because I can definitely think of some products off the top of my head which rely a lot on SEO, and it's so reliant on SEO that perhaps the users don't even recognize they're using a different product. They think they're Google. They're just
this was Thumbtack's problem when I started working with them. Yeah,
Reddit as well, Quora maybe too. And so, is the content growth channel ideally one where users find it through SEO, but then become like a native user of that product? Or can SEO itself be a sustainable growth strategy?
So I think, I've definitely focused my career on the former, right? Which is like SEO gets you the first visit. The second visit needs to come directly through the app or through your website, wherever. And that's how we operated at Grubhub. That's how we operated at Pinterest. But that's not always possible given the way your product works, right? For products that have an infrequent need. We talked about high retention, but some products like apartments.com, where I started my career, you just don't need to search for an apartment like every day of the year. Like you generally need it once a year for like a 1 to 2 month period. So we tried to do stuff to build a direct relationship between apartments.com and the user. We built more content related stuff, non-transactional. It just didn't work. So you know what? We just said we're going to be number one when you search anything apartment related on Google, and we're going to win that way. And we're going to buy AdWords too. And that's the best thing we got. And we sold that business for 570 million, still like a pretty good outcome. I know we're all focused on these companies worth $1 trillion now, but like pretty good return. And I think some people have been able to push past that, like Zillow. Zillow had the same exact problem with apartments.com. People don't search for new homes a ton of time. So they built a second product, this estimate, that created some voyeurism around what my house is worth, but maybe more importantly, what my neighbors' houses are worth. And then it created like real estate porn of like browsing dream houses, all of which keeps that engagement with Zillow so that you have the Zillow app and don't, go back to Zillow and go back to Google and are, a slave to their algorithm changes, right? And then there's other things people have done, which is more like the online travel agency world. So you have Expedia and Booking, and I don't know how well known this is, but they own every other search result. Every single one is owned between those two companies. So if you go search, I don't know, like hotels in Chicago or something, you're going to see 10 results. There are only two companies behind those results because they have bought anyone that gets any good coverage in Google. And their model is to have a portfolio of brands to make sure they suck up all the energy from Google. And they, of course, do a bunch of brand marketing to try to bring people direct and to try to build loyalty programs. But still the majority, people go back to Google and there's just nothing they can do about it. So they built more of an M&A type growth strategy and a portfolio of brands. And, those are still really big companies. Like Booking.com and Expedia have done awesome as public companies. So there's not only one path to victory. Certainly the path I prefer is the one you laid out. Get Google from the first visit, build really strong, retentive, direct products. And that's what I focus my career on. Sometimes it's just not possible. The frequency isn't there, or you're not able to get the core product value high enough. I think Airbnb did a good job of challenging that in travel, right? They created a product that was both better, meaning in a cooler part of the neighborhood, and cheaper. Like it was cheaper than hotel. It used to be, maybe not so much anymore. And that actually did get people to go direct to Airbnb the next time in a way that just never happened in travel. And that's part of why they built such an amazing business so quickly. But that's like thinking more about core product value innovation, right? Whereas travel was pretty static. It was like those hotels and flight listings for a long time. And Airbnb is like, what about a person's couch? And everyone's like, well, that's fucking stupid. And it turns out like that ended up sequencing towards something that, especially younger consumers preferred a lot more, which means they don't need to rank number one on Google to win in a space that's very hard to do that, because of course Expedia and Booking are very good at that game.
That makes sense. So we're running up on our allotted time. So I want to start bringing this to a close. This has been really, really fascinating. And we've spoken about lots of different ways that you've grown products, converted users, demonstrated core product market fit across many Web2 companies. And I think a lot of founders on this call are probably wondering, how does this translate to the Web3 context? How does this translate to the projects that they're working on? And so, do you have any parting words of wisdom or advice to builders who are starting projects in Web3 in terms of what's applicable and what might be different for them?
Generally, I've been in this game long enough to say, with these innovations, whether it be Web3 or AI, at the end of the day, the game is still basically the same, which is you need to figure out something that's genuinely valuable, and you can't hack that. You have to be building a real product that solves real problems. And if the blockchain is the best technical solution to deliver that, great. If AI is the best technical solution to deliver that, great. But you can't get sucked into the technology being the value prop, and you can't get sucked into the financial incentive being the value prop. They're not. They're just a means to deliver the core product value. So focus on that. And as you're thinking about that, also in the back of your head, think about, is there something in how this product is being built that's going to help it grow and be experienced by more users? Don't wait and say, well, my worst conversation I have with founders, I have a great product, I just need to find more people, that can experience it. I'm like, you're dead. Pivot. And no one wants to hear this, of course, right? But it's if you don't have a growth mechanism in the core product value you've created, it's over. Start over. So those would be the two things, right? Still, most of it should be, how do I deliver core product value? But at least you need 20% of your brain working on, if I'm on the path to do that, it's got to create content. It's got to make money. It's got to want to invite other people because it's multiplayer. Those are the things that I would just be 100% focused on if I were in your shoes.
Yeah. The technology does not equal the value proposition, and the financial incentive does not equal the value proposition. I think those are wise words to live by. Thank you so much, Casey, for coming in today. This was awesome. And thanks everyone for being here as well. Hope you guys got a lot of this. Fill out the survey that we just sent out. Casey, really, really appreciate it. Check out Reforged, guys, if you want to hear and learn more about all of these topics that go many magnitudes deeper than what we were able to cover today.
Yep. Thanks for having me, y'all. Thanks for coming on.